Welcome to our second virtual presidential dialogue series event. This one is focused on building racial justice through the law. I'm honored to have two very special guests with me today, Maryland Congressman David Trone and Jeffery Robinson, Deputy Legal Director and Director of the Trone Center for Justice and Equality at the American Civil Liberties Union. Thank you all so much for joining me here today. Now, you may have heard that our last event was Building Racial Justice Through Policing, and our local police chief joined us, Chief Marcus Jones, to talk about how policing is changing in this era. So discussion of racial justice and the law seems like a natural segue point for a conversation. I think we all would agree that this is a unique historical moment, a time of crisis, but also a time of growth. We all watched George Floyd's horrific murder over the summer and the widespread national protests that resulted. They sparked an awakening around the role of race and social justice. And to be fair, many of us were already woke, as they would say. It would be tough to be a person of color in the United States and not be aware, but there's a new energy around these conversations. Disparate racial impacts are being discussed more frequently, and in some circles, they're becoming the norm, not just a response to what's happening in the latest news story. They're expanding into policy, which is new for some communities. They're creating awareness of outcomes, of language, and of racial history. Now, my two guests today are uniquely qualified to speak to several aspects of this change and discourse, and I'm so grateful that they have made time to join us here today. Jeffery Robinson is the Deputy Legal Director and Director of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, Trone Center for Justice and Equality. The Trone Center houses the ACLU's work on criminal justice, racial justice, and reform issues. A graduate of Harvard Law School, Mr. Robinson has 4 decades of work as a public defender and private practitioner. His work has required him to navigate race, inclusion, and access in criminal justice and civil trials. His clients have included some of our society's most vulnerable people, including a defendant at Guantanamo Bay charged with the 9/11 attacks. Mr. Robinson speaks and writes widely about equality and justice, and his work at the ACLU allows him to engage in national discourse and issues of racial equality, U.S. history, and the role of the law. He is currently at work on a documentary called Who We Are, a Chronicle of Racism in America, which I know is going to be very powerful. Thank you so much, Mr. Robinson, for joining us. We also have on the panel Maryland Congressman David Trone, who is a political leader and ally in the struggle for racial justice. He's been outspoken about equity and justice initiatives, and his generous support for the ACLU created the Trone Center for Justice and Equality, which Mr. Robinson now leads. Congressman Trone has advocated for a ban on the box, and this is one where an employment form that asks about past criminal convictions. He has encouraged businesses to hire people with criminal convictions, and he has done so in his own business. He has also advocated for Pell Grants for incarcerated individuals and worked for programs that reduce jail populations. And for more than 2 decades, he has worked with the ACLU to expand voting rights to justice-impacted people. Congressman Trone was first elected to the House of Representatives in 2018 and is now in his second term serving the 6th District of Maryland. Thank you so much for being here, Congressman Trone, who is, again, my own congressman as well.
Great to be here, Dr. Pollard.
Thank you. Now, I thought we would open up today's discussion with some statistics to get us all on the same page so that we have a level playing field in terms of some information. In 2018, the Department of Justice looked at the racial identities of men in prison in the U.S., and here's what it looked like. In every age group, the ratio of men of color to white men was either 4-to-1 or 5-to-1, except for men ages 18 to 29, in which it was 12-to-1. Now, I'm struck by this because this is the age in which traditionally you would see young men entering into college, which is the space I operate in. But in some groups, they're entering prison instead of college. I'd like to hear from you all and ask you, what do you make of this? And maybe I'll start with Mr. Robinson now. Could you speak to this? And then I'll ask you, Congressman Trone, to offer some perspectives.
Thank you very much for having me, first of all. It's a pleasure to be here and to be part of a discussion on what is probably one of the most important topics in America right now. The numbers don't surprise me. They are shocking, they are horrific, but they're not surprising. And they're not surprising because having an understanding of the way the American system of criminal law has worked from the beginning would lead one to come to the conclusion that these numbers demonstrate exactly what the system was designed to do. And that may sound somewhat skeptical. It may sound somewhat conclusory, but I think that this is part of our challenge, to start looking not just at what happened today or 6 months ago or a year ago, but what has happened throughout our history as we have defined who is criminal and who is not, and how we treat those people that we define as criminal. And when you do that, what you'll see is that American enforcement of criminal law has always, from the time of the Constitution, had a racist and racial element that was intentional and purposeful, and that is playing out today, even as we speak.
So we should not be surprised, because indeed, as I hear you and your response, is that the system is only producing the outcomes in which it was seemingly intended to produce.
I think that's right. And for many people who say, well, isn't that an exaggeration? One of the things I'd ask you to think about is Article 4 of the Constitution, the document that founded our country. And in Article 4, what it says is that people who, they didn't use the term slave because that didn't come till the 13th and 14th Amendment. But what they said is essentially that people who were enslaved, if they escaped, had to be returned on demand. What that means is that attempts at freedom for Black people were literally unconstitutional as our country was founded. So the division or the antagonism between the Black community and law enforcement can be traced back to the Constitution, and quite frankly, back to colonial times before the Constitution.
Wow. Congressman Trone, what was your take when you looked at those numbers? Do you also share the perspective that they didn't surprise you, or were there some parts of it that did surprise you?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and totally not surprising. And I couldn't agree more with Jeff on this. I mean, we've really moved from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration. It's been a journey. And those numbers and what's happened this summer really exposed systemic racism, that we have in our institutions. And when you talk about 18 and 19-year-olds, you can really see the focus is on juvenile, justice. It's just been so wrong. And I think about the structural problems, and I go back to a conversation I had this summer after the George Floyd incident with the group of young men, and we talked about and asked them to describe their encounters with the police. And every one of their encounters was a very bad encounter, an encounter that someone like myself would never, ever experience. And, their encounters were different because one thing they did wrong: they were Black. It's just that simple. So whether they were driving while Black, walking while Black, having a beer of age in their backyard while Black, all of them had very unfortunate and wrong, headed encounters with the police force. So, we've got a real problem in this 18, 19-year-old group. We talk about school to prison pipeline. I mean, how can Black students be 3.5 times more likely to be suspended? We also know if they're suspended, they're 3 times more likely to be involved in a justice impacted by the justice system. 40% of our children, African-American children, end up in juvenile detention by the age of 25. I mean, these numbers are embarrassing. They're horrible for our country. And, one bill we've worked on this with Representative Tony Cardenas of California is to fully fund the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Protection Act. We passed a good act, but we didn't fund it. And what we know is that every dollar that we spend on this act to help these juveniles have a real chance, we get an $8 return. So Congress has got to step up in a big way.
You know what I love about your response, Congressman Trone, is it made me think that when we consider suspension rates, it may be the first act of sentencing that someone will experience in their life. And I think if we look at some of the statistics on sentencing around racial lines, it even becomes more interesting. I'd love to invite you to help me unpack this. The slide that's going up can talk a little bit about some of the stats here, where you look at how they have become, I think, far more problematic for different racial groups. And if you look at that of Black men compared to that of white men, can you help us unpack these a bit? And because I think some people will think, aren't sentencing for specific crimes laid out in law? I suspect the issue is far more complex than that. Mr. Robinson, can you help us understand some of the issues regarding the intersections of race and sentencing?
Well, I think it's a very interesting intersection, and it shows what I've been talking about and what Congressman Trone has just addressed. So the federal sentencing guidelines were made in part to address racial disparity in sentencing. Person A comes before the court charged with crime number 1, and person B comes before the court charged with crime number 1. They both have the same prior criminal history. Their offenses don't have anything significantly different in terms of their behavior. Person A gets a 30-month sentence and person B gets an 18-month sentence. And what you see is that those sentences are handed out on racial lines. And so one response to judge sentencing where the judges have complete discretion on what they're going to do. Well, let's have guidelines that are then going to guide judicial discretion, and that will reduce the level of disparity along racial lines in sentencings. And the federal sentencing guidelines came into effect, and the racial disparities still stayed there. Because whether there are guidelines or whether it is complete judicial discretion, the way that a prosecutor presents a case to a judge, the way that the judge hears that case has an impact on the sentence that's ultimately given. I am not against discretion in sentencing. I think judges need to have discretion in sentencing, but we have to confront the fact that that discretion far too often is played out in racial terms, meaning that if you look like me, and you look like Congressman Trone, and we're going before the same judge for sentencing for the same offense, chances are Congressman Trone is going to get a sentence that's lesser than mine. And it's got nothing to do with his status as a congressman. It has to do with the melanin in his skin. And that is simply what those statistics are showing, that whether it's under guidelines or whether it's under discretion, this problem exists in the criminal legal system.
And I love your descriptor. I think you would be such a phenomenal teacher. Just put that out there. This idea that we try to equalize or create the level field, say, okay, let's come up with the sentencing guidelines. Let's come up with this concept of mandatory minimums and to a certain extent trying to make the law appear to have some level of justice, that maybe perhaps she is indeed blind. But what we're seeing is that that's not actually the case. And maybe I could have Congressman Trone talk a little bit about this from the legislative perspective, because it's become very clear that there are ways in which legislation can actually encourage incarceration. I think many of us could think back to the 1994 crime bill, for example, which incentivized states to build more prisons and enact tougher sentences. And I realize this was before your time in Congress, Congressman Trump, but it's an example, I think, of how legislators can work for or against racial equity and oftentimes not even be aware of the consequences of what it is they're doing. As I understand it, states got extra funding for additional programs if only they agree to enforce certain sentencing guidelines. Have you seen impacts that are still in effect from that crime bill? And what role can legislation have in building racial justice when we talk about these types of conversations? We hear a lot about, matter of fact, during the recent election, we heard a lot about the 1994 crime bill driving incarceration rates. Can you talk in your own experience about how racial justice can be built through legislation?
I think you hit the nail on the head, Doctor, and that is the 94 crime bill was an absolute train wreck. And Bill Clinton, who helped drive that, himself declared in 2015, I signed that bill and I made the problem worse. And I want to admit it. $8.7 billion, earmarked for states to encourage them with their truth in sentencing laws, curbing paroles, and requiring people to serve 85% of their sentences. That led to a rise in prisons of 43%. But prior to that, we had the 84 Sentencing Reform Act. That added the mandatory minimums, the 3 strikes, you're out. Even if 2 of those strikes were nonviolent and they may have been drug trafficking, once you get that 3rd strike, everyone's done and they're in life without parole. So we've got to get sentencing reform done, and we're hopeful in the next session that's something we can accomplish. But this addressing excessive punishment and mandatory minimums, and we have 200,000 youth that are serving life sentences. 2/3 of those are of color. Now, obviously, that's not right. So we need to end mandatory minimums. We have to end 3 strikes, you're out, and we have to end life without the possibility of parole. Congressman Bass, who's a great friend and the leader of the Black Caucus, has a bill called the Second Look Act that allows us to look at sentencing modifications for those that have had long prison sentences, but can demonstrate rehabilitation or they've aged out. I have 7 prisons in my district, and when I visit the prisons, I meet with the wardens, the guards, the union members, and the individuals. Every single time they talk about he or she came in here at age 17, 18, they've completely aged out of prison. They made a mistake when they were at that age. They've paid more than the fair price for that, and they have no chance of going anywhere. It's $80 billion we're spending on prisons, and we should be trying to give people second chances and to help turn their lives around. But instead, we've just been focused on, punishment. So we've got to get a new Fair Sentencing Act. That first one that distinguished between crack cocaine and powder cocaine was good, but we didn't make it retroactive. And the same thing happened with the First Step Act that just was passed in the recent administration. We didn't make that retroactive. So we've got to get this all addressed in this next Congress.
Can I just follow up with something?
I was actually going to go right to you on that, because I'm sure you'd have a perspective both as a practicing attorney, certainly during that time, but also thinking about this issue as it's continued to evolve, about how we place greater emphasis on punitive versus rehabilitation and other things. So please, I'd love to hear your perspective.
Well, and I appreciate that, because I want to follow up on what Congressman Trone was talking about in terms of excessive sentences. I was a practicing lawyer in the 90s when judges were giving 30, 40, 50-year sentences in drug cases, like they were ice cream and cake. And one of the things that I think it's important to think about is the name Anders Breivik. It's Andres, I believe, and Breivik. He is a Norwegian who killed 77 people in what the Norwegian press called the worst act of terror since World War II. This is maybe 8-10 years ago. And for that 77 counts of homicide, he was sentenced to 21 years in prison. Now, you can't say Norway doesn't care about its citizens or the safety of its citizens, because look at their healthcare system. Look at their crime rate. Look at the way their citizens live. They care a lot about their citizens. So what is it that made them look at this circumstance, this horrific act, and say, we are going to imprison you for 2 decades, when in the United States, that person would either be facing a needle in their vein or life without parole. And part of what I am going to bring this back to once again is that the people of Norway have never othered another group of people in their history, like we have othered Black and brown people in our history. And so that original chart that you showed, showing that Black and brown people get longer sentences, get worse sentences. The problem for all of the people in America who are not Black and brown, and believe me, what's happening to Black and brown people is a problem for all Americans. But the problem for white Americans is that as our sentences keep going up and up, yours are going to go up too. And even if they're lower than ours, we end up with this circumstance where we have people serving these incredible amounts of time when they don't need to be imprisoned. And so when Congressman Trone talks about something like the Second Look Act, something that can say, we sentenced this person to X number of years 25 years ago, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and maybe something has changed. Maybe we should take another look. So I think the emphasis on extreme punishment is something that we should really think about and ask ourselves, so where does that come from? Because it's not like everybody in the world has the same view.
You know, I find this so provocative because I think about the conversations that are occurring right now nationally around, while the terminology says defund the police, I think it's really an indictment in a lot of ways around a system that is, in theory, supposed to believe that there's some hope of redemption. There's an opportunity for rehabilitation, that a crime oftentimes is a reflection of a circumstance that a person finds themselves in. And we believe that there can be at some level of rehabilitation. But I find it amazing that we are unable to have a more complex and richer conversation about these issues, about how we feel about the individual. And as you're pointing out, to go back to some of the original sins of this country, whether that be how we treated Native people and taking their land, but also then about the issue of slavery and how that issue of otherness is so permeated. Toni Morrison writes a wonderful collection of essays when she talks about Blackness in the literary imagination. And we look at canonical writers about how that has informed the way in which the very nature of the American narrative, the mythology of Americanism, is based in large parts about race in this country. Yet we don't name it, own it, or even try to address it. We just simply deal with the root, the causes or the outcomes, but not the radical root of the issues that are there.
And you just said that, you talk about the impact of slavery, and people should remember the 13th Amendment did not abolish slavery. No. It maintained it for those who are convicted of a crime. And that exception has had a huge amount of influence on our criminal legal system.
So how much of criminal justice reform belongs to the legislative area? Because I think that to me is an important question. When we think about your issue earlier, Mr. Robinson, you brought up about sentencing and that ability of a judge to be able to make certain types of decisions, or juries to make certain types of decisions, or prosecutors to decide what cases they'll advance and how they'll advance it. Some legislation has been blamed for worsening racial disparity among justice impacted people, notably, as we said, the 1994 crime bill. Some of this has been reversed, and you can see some downward trend here for the number of African Americans being imprisoned. But this has taken a decade, and the disparities are still significant. And some of us would say the change is still too slow. What are your thoughts about where reform needs to take place going forward? Maybe I'll start with you, Mr. Robinson, and then go to you, Congressman Trone, to hear about the theory of what needs to happen, and then hear about legislatively how one might go about doing that.
Well, one thing I would say is for people to take a look, because there were uprisings in Chicago in 1919 after a young African-American man was drowned on Lake Michigan by some white folks. And there was a commission that wrote a report. And then there was an uprising in Harlem in 1935, race-based. And there was a commission that wrote a report. And then there was the uprising in Detroit, Michigan in 1967. And a commission wrote a report. And then there was the uprising in Los Angeles in 1992 after the Rodney King incident. And a commission wrote a report. And they all said the same things. Wow. So we have known how to address this problem for over 100 years. The question is the willingness to do it. Now, as I think Congressman Trone will agree and will tell you, what Congress can do here is important, but it's in more of a leadership role, because most of the people in prison are in state and local prisons. If you let everyone in federal prison out tomorrow, you would still have almost 2 million people in prison in America. So Congress can do things like pass laws and have financial incentives in the opposite direction of the 94 crime bill. Congress can do things like when the legislation Congressman Trone talks about, those are only impacting federal prisoners, but they can be a guide for states to pass similar laws so that states can impact prisoners as well. The thing I'd like to say about this issue about defund the police, even the most radical proponents are not saying that the police should disappear tomorrow. What the ACLU has done, and this is a significant change in our stance, our leader, Anthony Romero, our executive director, wrote a blog where he talked about divest and reinvest, meaning taking money out of police departments and putting it into services that have been recognized since 1919 that can address the root causes of what we call criminal activity. And when you think about, I'm just looking to my left here for a second because I want to get these numbers. When you say divest from the police, I would ask everybody, take a look at your local police budget. Your annual police budget, because in 2017, in the city of New York, it was over $4 billion a year. In Chicago, in Detroit, $310 million a year. In Baltimore, $480 million a year. In Los Angeles, $1.4 billion a year. You start going line by line about where that money is spent, and you will find, I'm trying to not curse, you will find a large amount of money. And when you then look at agencies that don't have the funding to respond to circumstances where the police don't need to respond, and yet we're sending the police. So before you push defund the police or divest and reinvest, before you put that into the category of just some radical thing that doesn't make sense, take a look at the numbers in local police budgets, and then let's have a discussion about how much money we should be spending and how much money we are spending.
And that's only then even more amplified when you also add on there with the militarization of the police as well, oftentimes where they receive goods and training that move them away from community-based forms of policing to a much more adversarial, militaristic relationship with the population that they are serving and protecting. It becomes a very different type of conversation. Congressman, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this issue in terms of, because I think this is so provocative that the legislation and the government can be, in this case, leaders. They can be the ones who help show the way. They become the guides. Do you see that actually happening? Is that a shared belief that you see among your elected colleagues about this issue?
Unfortunately, it's not shared to the degree in which it should be shared. But both of your comments are just spot on, and I really appreciate that. But in many cases, we've given the police just too many things to do, and that they aren't trained to do and don't do that well. I mean, think about the mental health crisis. That's been dumped on the police. You know, we need to work on social workers that can better handle and diffuse and de-escalate many of the problems that happen in the mental health area. And think about addiction and what's happened there with our police. I mean, the scourge of opioids, which has now taken 550,000, deaths since the year 2000, and then treating addiction like a crime when it's really a disease. If we look back in 1980, we had roughly 40,000 people in prison for drug offenses. Now we have the population is 2 times bigger, but instead of 2 times more people in jail for drug offenses, we have 14 times more people in jail for drug offenses. So our police are being forced to deal with an addiction problem. Clearly, that's a medical problem, not a jail problem. So as Jeffrey said, we got to pay it forward and help folks prepare for success and focus on different outcomes and not focus on this punishment. 1 in 9 people in prison is now serving a life sentence. It doesn't make any sense at all. And a third of those are without parole. That's certainly wrong. There's not a prison I've never visited that every single time the warden or one of the assistants will say, he or she is a model prisoner, I would trust them in my home with my kids because they have aged out of crime. I mean, I recall Vehicles for Change up in Baltimore. I spent a half a day up there, and they bring in folks that are returning citizens. And, as you mentioned, my company has hired over 500 returning citizens, and that's really, really important. But we talked a long, long time with a gentleman there, and he had been in jail for murder since he was 16, 17 years of age. Phenomenal individual. Made a mistake. It was something that was clearly happened that shouldn't have happened. But now, 30 years later, he's not the same person. And he can be will be a very productive member of society. But we've got to believe in second chances. And too often in America, we don't think about second chances. And that's what we've got to try and focus on.
I have a question from one of our students for both of you that I think might be a good place to insert here. Amy, she is a member of our MC Leads program, which is building leadership capacity with students. And she posed 2 questions. The first one is for Congressman Trone. How do you plan on reducing our jail population? And what steps have you taken to end mass incarceration, especially for minorities with small offenses? And then there's a second question for you, Mr. Robinson, which I'll pose after I give Congressman Trone an opportunity to respond. Well, since we have it on the screen, I'll go ahead and read it. Almost 7 decades after the murder of Emmett Till comes a similar case with the murder of 15-year-old Quawan Charles in Louisiana. What can we do to make sure his murderers and law enforcement who act on racial bias are brought to justice? Very provocative questions about leadership. Even going to your last question that you responded to, what are the ways in which Congressman Trone, you see at the legislative level that you're trying to reduce the jail population? And then certainly, Mr. Robinson, this idea of law enforcement and racial bias, how that plays itself out, how we see the same crimes replicated over and over and over and over again. Congressman Trone.
No, that's a really great question. I appreciate that. And this whole issue of, the racial bias is 82% of our folks in prison are Black and brown. Obviously, that's insane. So, but we first got to figure out how to decarcerate. And as Jeffrey said, 85% of our prisoners in the U.S. are at the state level. So we have a bill right now that we're working on and moving forward. And hopefully it's going to be a bipartisan bill in both houses. And it's a decarceration bill called Community First Pretrial Reform and Decarceration. We're working with Brian Stevenson, who has been an awesome leader in the whole jail reform system and the death penalty. And most states get funding from the federal government for their prison systems. So we're going to require them and give them up to come up with innovative ideas to find ways they can decarcerate. Some of them might be about cash bail. Some might be about, probation systems. Some might be public treatment on drugs or alcohol, et cetera. So we've got to address these systemic inequalities and aim at disproportionately low-income individuals that are disadvantaged throughout our system and reduce the incarceration rates. I mean, how can we have a system that 5 years later, 75% of the folks are back incarcerated again? I mean, that's a failed system. I had the Bureau of Prisons head in my office about a year ago, and we talked about what metrics do they measure on outcomes. The answer, surprisingly, none. They don't track anything. If you don't measure things, how can you track them? So we're going to be working with the Biden administration, not just on criminal justice reform, but also prison reform, because we've got to measure outcomes. And then we can see when we do training on education, we do apprenticeship training, all those things, Pell Grants, we'll talk about later probably. Those things are driving great outcomes, and they're all very cost efficient, but you got to spend money up front, and then we can create better outcomes for folks across the country.
Very good. Thank you. Mr. Robinson, that second question posed by our student about law enforcement who act on racial bias and then are brought to justice. How do we start to reduce those things?
One thing to understand is that 2020 has been an incredible year. We have seen the lynching of George Floyd. We have seen Breonna Taylor. We have seen stories about Ahmaud Arbery in Alabama. We have seen all these things, and many people will think, oh my God, it's horrific, it's amazing, but it's not new.
No.
So don't go thinking that 2020 is presenting a circumstance to America that's new, because it's not. This has happened over and over and over and over again. And again, for the students, if you'd like to take a peek, go back and do some research on what happened in America between April and September in 1963, because you'll see Medgar Evers getting killed. You'll see the 16th Street bombing. You'll see all kinds of things that were happening. The difference between then and now is this.
Yep.
Cell phones and surveillance cameras and other things that are making America have what the author William Burroughs called a naked lunch moment with policing in America. Naked lunch meaning that moment when everyone has to look at what is really on the end of their fork. Between 2010 and 2015, the 10 largest police departments in America paid over $1 billion in lawsuits for police misconduct. Go back and look at that same period of time and try and find the number of police officers that were prosecuted for anything, and then try and find out of that number the number of police officers that were convicted of anything.
And then in that number, how many of them did not find jobs in another police district?
Exactly.
After? Yeah, so
exactly.
Yeah.
And so part of what is happening now in America is that we are having cases like George Floyd's case, like the case in Wisconsin with Jacob Blake, like other cases, and we are going to be seeing how the criminal legal system responds to these cases. And the difference, the thing that I hope for now, is that there is going to be so much more scrutiny on these cases. Number one, I think that's important because the public has seen the videotapes.
Right.
So if the officers the officers charged with killing George Floyd are presumed innocent, they have a right to a fair trial, and I believe they will get one. But America will be able to judge for itself what happens as a result in that case. And I think that one of the things you're seeing today is this movement toward a new wave of prosecutors who are looking to engage in the ways that Congressman Trone was talking about in terms of looking at things perhaps in a different way, looking at their power to charge people in a different way. And one of the things that they're going to have to look at is, what do I do to hold law enforcement accountable so that I can say to the community, the badge and the uniform mean nothing when it comes to judging a person's behavior. If you want to build respect for law enforcement, two critical things you can do are, number one, as Congressman Trone said, take away responsibilities that law enforcement officers aren't trained for and aren't able to conduct in an appropriate way. But then number two, hold law enforcement officers accountable when they behave in ways that are criminal. And the fact that that is a somewhat radical notion in America tells you how far we have to go, because it shouldn't be radical at all.
You know, it is an intriguing thing to me, because then we think about the consequences of that, about the public trust issues that you mentioned before, and how all of this plays itself out when we all start to bear witness to these things, and at the same time have no way of reconciling what we see versus what we've been told about the law and what the law enforcement is. When we think about criminal justice reform, yet we see, I love your example earlier about, commission and a report, all the things we've known for all these years, yet we fail to act on it. My fear is, in this example of the question, is that we become numb to seeing it, that we become overexposed at such a level that after a while, it just becomes, oh, there's yet another video, there's another hashtag, there's another protest. I'm hopeful that we're not in that moment. I want to go back to something that you brought up, Congressman Trone, and I want to pivot to this issue about the business sector. People who have served their sentences oftentimes have a very hard time getting employment. In fact, I was just speaking not too long ago. I have a friend who relocated to this area and was looking for work, but had a criminal conviction in his record 20 years ago. But since that time has led a tremendously fruitful life, has done all the work that one could do, has done the hard work to position himself with education and training, and was struggling. And I think in a tight economy, these folks will generally be left out because they're considered higher risk. Congressman Trone, can you talk a bit about your perspective on that as an advocate and as a business owner? Because I've heard you speak so eloquently of it. What role can business owners play in building racial equity for formerly incarcerated people?
Well, we as business owners have a responsibility to be part and parcel of our community. And if you're going to be part of the community, one thing that we can absolutely do is help those that made a mistake have that second chance I speak about all the time. And that is the Workforce Justice Act of 2020. So we wrote the act. I got Maxine Waters as my co-sponsor, and it's just simply, as you said, banning the box, because once a person has a criminal conviction, they are going to be unable to get a job. Their application goes right in the trash can. So the Trone Center, we put together a commission, and we looked at with all business leaders from around the country and academics, and we talked and thought about what solutions were, and clearly banning the box and then having a thoughtful, fair way to keep someone's conviction totally silent, yet have them have every opportunity to get that job based on their qualifications, their personality, how they present themselves, etc. But that statistic you showed us, 75%. I mean, why would we expect anything different than failure in our system on recidivation if we can't get folks three things: a job, a roof over their head, and then transportation to that job so they can stay with it? But if we don't do those three straightforward things, we're never going to be successful turning this around. So that talks later on about Pell Grants. It talks about apprenticeship grants. Really, when you come out of prison, we should be thinking about it like you graduate from college. Recruiters come into the college 6 months, a year in advance. We should think that when someone's coming out of prison, we know their skill sets, we know their lack of skill sets, we know where they want to return to. Maybe it's stay in Maryland, maybe it's go back to Charlotte or go to Boston. And then we got to connect those prisoners with jobs. And we need to convince business, because there's 2.3 million people in prison. 90% of those will eventually be discharged. We have a labor shortage prior to COVID, and these are awesome workers. In my company, we have a 14% better retention rate. So these returning citizens can make the company, save the company dollars on turnover, and we can do good by just creating a good system that's much more virtuous. So we've got to have that recruiting in our prisons, and then the training that ties into it, and then bring them back into jobs with healthcare, et cetera, in their communities. So one of the things we want to do is convince large employers, retailers, people like Amazon, how they can do pilot projects. And I've spoken with all these different groups where they're going to say, we're going to recruit 5,000 folks that are returning citizens. And then we're going to make sure they have the training when they're on the inside. And then we have the wraparound services when they come out, because they need help also. Maybe they have mental health challenges. Maybe they have addiction challenges. So we've got to wrap around those services, or we just condemn ourselves to a circular system that is just doing no one any good. And it's clearly harming folks of color and low income in a very, very disproportionate way.
I loved your comment about virtuous. I kept thinking, wouldn't that be a wonderful moment to get to as a country, that we describe our criminal justice system as virtuous? I'm an English teacher by training. Words mean something. I would offer that right now, many perceive it to be the antithesis of that. That your comments, though, speak to one of the questions that came in. Nancy Newton, who's the director of Montgomery College's contract educational services with the Montgomery County Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, posed this question. She said, we provide education to justice-impacted learners at the Montgomery County Correctional Facility in Boyds, the Pre-Release Center, and the Montgomery County Detention Center in Rockville. In addition, one of my other programs serves the educational needs of learners dealing with substance abuse from the Montgomery County Drug Court. 95% of people in county jails will return to the community. To decrease the chances of recidivism and increase the chances of success for returning citizens, effective partnerships between community colleges and county jails with additional input from business owners and leaders are needed. In what ways can you imagine pooling the county's talents and resources in order to provide more opportunities for such partnerships? Congressman Trone, I'd love to hear your thinking on this. And certainly, Mr. Robinson, if there are examples that you know also nationally, I'd love to hear that as well. Congressman Trone?
No, I think she hit the nail on the head, absolutely. And it can't just say it's an education. You can't just say it's a job training. You can't say it's creating a job, because you've got to do all three of those. But on top of that, you've got to find a place to put their head at night, get food on their table, transportation. And again, often these folks are dealing with mental illness and addiction. So that's why we need this wraparound. But I think the community colleges are uniquely positioned to partner and work with prisons, work with businesses, and all of us come together, and philanthropists, to try and figure out a system that could be virtuous, and now is anything but, of course. And down in Alabama, I talked to a gentleman that worked in this and he was up in Hagerstown, and he used to work down in Alabama, and they had the community college tied in with the prison, figuring out what type of jobs were out there with industry. And maybe they were welders, maybe they were, someone to be a truck driver, but all kinds of knowing the jobs, knowing the training that's needed, and then getting the community college to connect with the prison in advance to train the workers and then get the jobs to be hired out. And it's a system that can work. And we've got to figure out how to get a template for that across the country. And then we can figure out how to use the federal government to help encourage that behavior. But I think community colleges have a big opportunity and a role to play in this.
Thank you for that. Mr. Robinson, I've mentioned that Montgomery County, in other places, is a pretty progressive place. But still, when we look at the variety of data on policing, impacts are still very disparate. This data from 2017 in the county, and African Americans were 18% of the population, but 42% of police searches during traffic stops. Our county council has been very proactive about pushing for equity, but I've seen that the ACLU and certain chapters say, quote, collecting data is not enough. Even policy change doesn't always change attitudes. How can we excise the kind of attitudes that result in disparate results such as these?
Part of this is about a national re-education on the true narrative about our history. Because you see those statistics and people say, oh, well, Black people must be doing something in order to get stopped. If you look at every city that tried stop and frisk as an aggressive policing program, and let me be clear, when I say stop and frisk, I mean programs where police are stopping people who are doing absolutely nothing suspicious. Every city where that result happened, what you saw was the lowest number was about 75%. So 75% or higher of the number of people who were stopped were doing absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. And so one thing you take away from that is you can't make your community safer by stopping and frisking innocent people who are not breaking the law. The other thing they found, though, is that when they did do follow-up on what was actually happening with the people that were doing something, what they found in New York City and Boston was that it was more white people who had either drugs, guns, or doing something illegal than it was Black people. And I'm saying this because the narrative in America is in the Black areas, Black neighborhoods, there's just more crime. There are more people behaving criminally. And this narrative is very, very powerful. But you don't see police officers doing undercover operations for drugs in white high schools. You'll see that in Black high schools, but not in white high schools. And if you think white kids aren't smoking weed at the same rate that Black kids are, you have to be literally insane. And so the point I'm making is that what we are going to have to be about is literally a changing narrative in America, talking about the wealth gap and why that is. I have judges that want to sentence people saying, well, you're living in poverty and your father lived in poverty and 3 of your generations have lived in poverty. You just, why hasn't your family done better? You want an answer to that question, Judge? Let's start talking about the racialized history in the city. Let's just say Baltimore, for example. You want to talk about redlining and housing so that Black families haven't had homes that they could mortgage so they could help their kids get through school or have a start out in adult life. You start talking about the history of what has happened in these communities, and people have to sit up and take notice. The last thing I'll say about this is in that book, Naked Lunch. It's an incredible book. It's an old book. It's about drug addiction. I'm not suggesting that anybody read it because it's really a hard read. But there is a chapter entitled, Wouldn't You? And the subtitle is, Yes, You Would. And what the chapter talks about is the geometry of need. And it essentially says that human beings have needs that have to be fulfilled for food, for shelter, for love, for money, whatever that need is. And when that need reaches a certain frequency, there is nothing that will stop that human being from trying to fulfill that need. Wouldn't you? Yes, you would. And if we can start looking at life choices by putting ourselves in the position of the other that we think about and say, how would I react if I was facing those exact same conditions? I think that's the start to rewriting the narrative about our criminal legal system in America and seeing that it actually, I would just say this, Congressman Trone's company is making more money by hiring people who then stay longer with the company. It's not just his good heart. It actually is good business, good sound dollars and cents business that his company is better for doing this. And if we get people to understand that, then it's not like a sacrifice or we're doing something for those people. We're improving our entire community.
That is profound, so that we're all a part of the public good. We're all engaged in the work of doing that. I was going to ask you about some implicit bias, but I think your response did that. I want to talk a little bit about voting rights, because I think we just went through, and maybe, I don't know if we're still going through, a historic election in this country right now. But you can see from a slide that I'm going to put up in a moment that the rough average of 5 million people a year are disenfranchised due to felony criminal convictions, and states vary widely on how they impose these restrictions. You can see that in the past 6 years, there have been a steady growth in the number of people with their voting rights restored. But given how close the recent election was, 5 million people is a lot. The report which this graph is drawn from, which is from the Sentencing Project, says that, quote, "of felony disenfranchisement provisions have an outsized impact on communities of color." I'm going to ask both of you to respond to this trend. And what do you think could be done to reverse it, this disenfranchisement that we're seeing of voters?
I start on that one with the federal level. Ever since Shelby County versus Holder, and Jeff can expound on that, but that court decision turned the 65 Voting Rights Act on its head, and we began to see increasing disenfranchisement across the country, especially many of our southern Republican states, unfortunately. So we've got to figure out how to expand voting rights at the federal level. HR 1, and we made that 1. The number 1 bill we passed this year was For the People Act, and it creates automatic voter registration across the country. It ensures those that had a felony sentence have their rights fully restored, opens up early voting, simplifies absentee voting. The mission is everybody needs to vote. We support a national holiday for voting. We've got to drive our voting percents up, up, up. If we all vote, we're going to get a more fair America. So this has got to be a huge, huge deal. We're going to try and get it done again next year. The Senate refused to pick it up. I'm sure they'll have the same type of an attitude here, but we've got to keep working then in states. And the ACLU certainly worked very diligently in Florida, and Jeff can talk about that in other states, where we made great progress with the referendum. So returning citizens have paid the price.
Yep.
Should they be allowed to vote? They have to be allowed to vote. It's just morally wrong that they're not allowed to vote. And then once that passed and the referendum won, the legislature in Florida went and chipped away at all the folks that we brought into the system because we're trying to do good. And they're trying to take them out of the system because all they're trying to do is play politics. And that's a problem we have in this on the Hill here, is that, we Democrats, our focus is, why don't we try and do things good? And that's our number one mission. And our number two mission is often getting elected. But unfortunately, the Republican mission has consistently been getting elected. And by focusing on that, they're looking to change the electorate to look like the electorate that'll vote Republican. And that's just, I find it morally reprehensible.
Mr. Robinson, your thoughts on that?
I think Congressman Trone hit it right out of the park. The states we call red states, we don't know that they're red states because they're red states because so many people have been disenfranchised. There are over 1 million people that couldn't vote in Florida. We don't know what would have happened if those people had voted in Florida. And I think this is another place where taking a step back is really important. When did we start the idea that people who committed a crime couldn't vote? Where did that come from? Because that was not the norm before the Civil War. After the 13th Amendment, which maintained slavery for those convicted of a crime, once again, we start to understand our history. After the Civil War, 90% of the people who were in convict leasing arrangements were Black. Non-white prisoners in Alabama jumped from 2% in 1850 to 74% in 1870. And states started passing disenfranchisement laws. And how did they do it? It was very easy. States that had large Black populations started passing more and more disenfranchisement laws. And states that had small Black populations passed either no disenfranchisement laws or restricted them. Maine is a state in America where you can vote if you are in jail. Why do they not have felony disenfranchisement?
They don't have a lot of Black folks.
You can ask yourself, but you can see what the population of Maine looks like. So it really does come down to, and I know that there are a lot of young people who think, oh, the thing is rigged, or it really doesn't matter how you vote. If voting didn't matter, why is one of our political parties spending so much time and so much effort to limit people's votes? Because they know voting matters. They know it matters. And so this is an area where federal legislation, H.R. 1, like the congressman said, can set an example for states. And then I think you are going to see more movements in states. The state legislature in Florida chipped away at Amendment 1, which re-enfranchised over 1 million people. But the ACLU is looking at other states where we can bring similar movements and similar kinds of legislation so that we can get people the right to vote. And so people can then have a say in their government. I thought that's what democracy was supposed to be about.
Yeah, unless you start asking the why, I would not want your voice to count. Then you start to come up with a very different set of conclusions. It speaks to me because right now, several people I know, including many members of the college community here, are reading a recent book by Ibram Kendi about how to be an anti-racist. And in effect, he argues that we can't stand still and do nothing and say that we're not racist, because if we know that there are things to be done and we're not doing it, we're all being complicit in these actions. And we have to be actors in trying to dismantle racism, to actually name it, own it, work on it, and do the individual work, but also the systemic work that comes from that. And what I find really provocative about this is I see this in the work that both of you do. Mr. Robinson's, your documentary, your speaking tour, your defense of the most vulnerable, this idea of the active engagement in this type of work. Congressman Trone, your generous support of the ACLU's efforts at litigation and research, your own push for jobs and voting rights. So I'm going to guess that both of you would agree with Kendi's premise and his how to be an anti-racist approach to anti-racism, that we all got to be in this together. Otherwise, we are complicit in that. How do you make the case to folks who aren't educated about our history? I was struck by Mr. Robinson, a number of your YouTube presentations, but also even your conversation here. To understand the history of this country means that you have to truly understand the history of race in this country. And if you choose not to do that, you in effect are not truly understanding the history of this country. How do you explain this to people who don't want to be educated about the totality of this history? How do you talk to folks who feel they're being labeled and threatened by the label of racist or biased? How do we start to really get to the root of some of these issues? Who'd like to go
first?
One
of the things that I try and do in most of my presentations is just to start by asking, if anyone in this room has ever owned an enslaved person, raise your hand. And over 10 years of doing this speaking, no one has ever raised their hand. Slavery is not our fault. We didn't do it. We're not to be held accountable for it, but it is our shared history. And when we try and make it something less than it was, when we try and impose a narrative on it that washes it all away, then we are doing damage to ourselves. So this is not about blaming anyone, but it is about reclaiming our history. The power of narrative is one of the most powerful things. It is a racial thing. And by that, I mean the human race. Narrative is one of the most powerful forms of political authority. And there is a fantastic movie that a Western that people maybe haven't seen. It's old. It's called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And at the end of this movie, someone says, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. And that's what we have done with American history. We have a legend of America as being about freedom and equality and justice. And it's not that America hasn't stood for those things. America has demonstrated its greatness again and again and again. And America is one of the most racist countries on the face of the earth. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. And that's just because humans aren't just one thing. And all countries are a group of humans. And everybody listening to this knows that you've been a saint and a sinner at some time in your life. And so those two things existing in a person, just by extrapolation, of course, good and evil can exist in a country. By denying our history, we are denying the opportunity to move forward in this country. And I want to end this concept by saying this. We have been at racial tipping points in America on several occasions. When the colonies formed the Constitution, we had the opportunity to say, all this stuff about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it's really not consistent with owning people as enslaved persons. But America doubled down and put white supremacist values in the Constitution, the 3/5 clause, protecting the international slave trade.
Right.
Once again, at the end of the Civil War, we were at a tipping point. Reconstruction was working. And there was the rise of the KKK and black codes, and we rolled right back. In 1968, the civil rights movement was at the tip of moving us forward. Martin Luther King gets shot in the neck, and what came next was Richard Nixon and the war on drugs. We are at a tipping point in 2020 in America. And the question is, are we going to roll back like we have every single time we've come to that tipping point in this country? Or is this generation going to do something different? And so the issue of hope is a really, really important issue, but it is connected to the concept of action. Hope does not cause action. It's the other way around. Action is what causes hope. I have hope for America because I have seen Black people, brown people, white people, Asian people, all demonstrating in the streets of America this year together in ways that have never happened before. The anti-Vietnam marches were basically all white. There were some people of color, but they were majority white. And the civil rights marches in the South in the 60s, there were white people that marched, but they were mainly all Black. That's not what you see in the streets of America today. It is different. And so there is reason to have hope. Some of the things Congressman Trone has outlined that we can do in Congress, some of the things the ACLU is doing, there is reason for hope, but the reason is that people are taking action. And so whether it's by voting, by holding your elected officials accountable, by getting involved in local organizations, to the extent that you become active, you will increase the amount of hope in America for us to get to a place where we should be on issues of racial justice.
Let me pose.
Yeah, I really think that, what Jeffrey talked about there is just really eloquent, and it's action is absolutely where we need to be. And that, as he said, will lead to the hope. But so often we get to a tipping point, we just let it go. We get there, we let it go. So we've got to crystallize and move on this moment. And, I'm hopeful with Kamala and Joe Biden's leadership that we're going to be able to move forward in this area. And it's certainly, the top of our priority list. And, it's about doing the bills that can make a difference, whether it's voting, it's jobs, it's housing, it's education in prisons. There's so much that needs to be done, but, it's just not enough to say to, Kennedy's point that, I'm not racist. We've got to actually say we must be anti-racist is a better way to look at it, and use our platform then, the platform in Congress, the platform in business, the platform as a white man, and use that to set the example of how we can be anti-racist. And that welcomes many conversations that are, certainly uncomfortable, but you never get anywhere when you're comfortable. We've got to be able to move when, we're not feeling our way in an easy way. We've got to make it difficult. And, it's awesome, the folks that have taken such leadership here, and we've got to continue to elevate here in Congress the voices, such as Karen Bass and others, that are leading us in this space, because, we don't have these conversations, we're not going to move forward. It's not a Black problem, it's a human problem. And we owe it to the young people that are in the streets today, and it's going to make our country long-term more equitable. And I was talking to Speaker Pelosi this morning, and one thing we spoke about was the lack of equity that we have in this country, where in the last 4 years, those at the top of the food chain have gotten richer and richer, and those at the bottom have gone the other way. It's pulling itself apart. We're polarizing, and we've got to bring that equity back. And so I know she's thinking about setting up a commission to think about this equity piece. I think that's a smart policy idea. And, we can really then begin to make a difference, but it's got to go to action, a bias for action.
I love that, because, right, we don't want another commission with another report that we don't do anything about, right? So that idea of action, it strikes me too, because you mentioned this earlier, Congressman Trone, this idea of the school to prison pipeline. And one of the audience's questions came in that speaks to this. He says that, and this comes from Elijah Wheeler, who's executive director of the Montgomery County Collaboration Council for Children, Youth, and Families. And his question says this, that Maryland leads the nation in the incarceration of Black men ages 18 to 24, with an overwhelming amount of these Black men serving longer sentences, having been sentenced prior to the age of 25. Given what we know about adolescent brain development and young people aging out of behaviors, what steps should be taken at a policy level to reduce these disparities and address differential treatment that is intrinsically racist within our criminal justice system? I'd love to give you an opportunity to talk about that.
I think the key is always goes back, I think Jeffrey's going to agree, to education. Mm-hmm. You know, once we start off behind the 8 ball, we can never catch up. I'm on the Education and Labor Committee, and 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, they're the ones that have to be hearing tens and hundreds of thousands of words every day. If they're parked in a video game or parked in an area that they aren't getting that input, their brain's not going to develop. We've got to have pre-K. It's got an 8-to-1 return on our investment. 100%. Everybody has to have pre-K. It should be full day. But if our children aren't reading by the age of 7 or 8, they're behind. And once we fall behind, and that's what's happened to our minority and our low-income communities, they've fallen behind. They never catch up. And that's the systemic problem we've got to address. We've got to pay that forward. Take that $80 billion we spend on prisons, the $78 billion we spend every year on addiction, and figure out ways to pay that forward into education. And then people will be able to see opportunities, for better choices. We've also got to get more mental health professionals in our schools. And, we're working on a bill now that talk about how to fully fund schools with the right mental health professionals. And COVID has really led to a huge breakdown in the mental health area and addiction across this country. These are 2 of the worst byproducts to COVID and the economic collapse. And it's really affecting our children. And we've always got to be thinking about the next generation. So we've got to get mental health professionals into the schools so we have quality mental health work. And Representative Ayanna Pressley out of Boston has a bill called Ending the Pushout Act. And it talks about reducing school suspensions and expulsions, because that data we said earlier, is directly correlated with incarceration. And then we've got to collect data, and we've got to have about discriminatory practices that happen in school. No one's accumulating data, and without the metrics, you can't form good policy that's anchored, as Jeff said, in action.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Robinson, your thoughts on that?
I would just say that I was thinking about the person that asked the question and the focus on suspensions and what that means. You get suspended and then you're not in class, and so you fall behind. You get suspended, and if you are an athlete trying to go to college based on your athletic ability, that suspension is now on your record. And that may have an impact on whether you can continue your education by using your athletic ability. There are all sorts of ways that suspensions and expulsions come into play. And once again, going back to, I hate to be a broken record, but why don't we take a step back and ask ourselves, why is this person being suspended? People may remember a viral video of a young girl being picked up and thrown across the room in South Carolina by a police officer because she wouldn't give up her cell phone. And the ACLU actually represented a young woman in that same class who was arrested because she stood up and was saying to the police officer, stop doing that. Don't do that to her. What if the girl had deaths in her family? What if she hadn't had anything to eat that day? What if her mother or father had lost a job and there was chaos going on in the home? Those are the kind of behaviors where, give me your phone, give me your phone. No, I won't. Why not? And then you hear what's happening in the child's life. And the last thing you want to do is suspend them. But this again comes back to how these decisions are made, who is making them, and funding, so that we have teachers who have the time to engage with students in ways that don't result in suspensions or expulsions. And I will say again, you brought up the issue, Doctor, of militarized equipment. If the federal government gives you a tank, guess who has to pay for maintenance on it and spare parts and upkeep? The city that gets it. And so you go into those police budgets, and once again, we are spending money asking the police to solve problems that by their very definition, the police cannot solve. Even police officers will tell you this. So part of changing the narrative is changing the idea about social services. Oh, that's just for poor people. You know, that's a handout. That's us doing something for them. No, that's actually making a community stronger. It's taking into account that resources aren't distributed in an equitable way in the community. And if we have resources in our government, we need to be focused on those areas that have been the victim of non-equitable distribution. So there are ways to address this, even in a democracy, even where you have to do things one step at a time. There are ways to address this, but they all, in my view, come back to challenging the narrative on why does the police department need hundreds of millions of dollars every year? Explain that to me. And when people say there'll be all these murders if we don't fund the police, I would really challenge people in any city in America to come up with 10 murders that the police prevent. The police don't prevent crime. The police respond to crime. That's the way it has always been. And if we think that having more and more police will make us safer, just look at the situation that we're in America right now with 2.3 million people in prison and ask yourself, how safe do you feel?
I have several questions I could pose to what you said, but I've got about 4 from audience members I want to get through because I want to be respectful of your time because you've given me so much of it and really have fueled my intellectual curiosity. And I'm going to go to one from Hope Gleischer. She's the chief strategy officer for Identity, which is a group that serves youth and their families in Montgomery County with a focus on Latino youth in high poverty areas of the county. And she's asked, 2 Montgomery County council members have introduced a bill to end the Montgomery County Public School Resource Officer Program. Another county council members have voiced their support for the roles of SROs that they play in schools. Data shows that SROs arrest Black and Hispanic students at higher rates than white students, and that those arrests have harmful long-term effects, somewhat of what we were talking about earlier. At the same time, in our experience, SROs have been key partners in de-escalating conflicts within the schools and in challenging dangerous biases by opening lines of dialogue between communities of color and law enforcement. Now, based on your experiences and best practices, what specific reforms do you recommend the county pursue to eliminate racist and racialized practices and ensure safety in our public schools? Because if we want to disrupt the cycle, I think this idea of continuing this conversation about what happens in school is an important one. Mr. Robinson, you want to take that first?
Police officers have no place in schools. I don't care if you call them a SRO or a TRO or any other name. They're wearing a badge and a gun, and they place people under arrest and they take them to jail. That's what police officers do. So get the police officers out of school. If you want resource human beings in schools to do these jobs, then let's invest in that. Let's invest in the things that are causing violence in schools. And so once again, we're going back to first principles. We're taking a step back before we try and take a step forward. Police officers do one thing. They arrest people. They're not counselors. They're not psychiatrists or psychologists. They're not friends for the students. They are law enforcement officers with a badge and a gun. And when we start asking them to do things outside that role, we will always get into trouble. Take the money out of the police department and put it into organizations that can do those same roles in the schools without carrying badges and guns.
Congressman Trone, your thoughts?
No, I think Jeff nailed it. I mean, having police in a school is just simply a really bad idea. It's just that simple. And the things you talked about is what are they doing there? Well, they're de-escalating situations. They're fostering better communication. We need different types of resources there that are trained on de-escalation, on better communication. And I think we have the wrong people doing the wrong job. So we've got to reimagine what our police force is all about and can't just give them everything that someone thinks they should be there, because that's just a really bad idea. And as you said, all the data is conclusive. You know, folks that they have a skirmish turns into a criminal record. It's just, and it should have been de-escalated. So it's a train wreck.
You know what I find so compelling when I think about the certain groups of occupations that we start to expand the scope of their role, inevitably we get ourselves in trouble. One, because the folks who are trained to do a primary job receive that training, yet we start to ask them to do more, which they may not have that level of training for, and to be quite frank, may not have been the job that they signed up for. I often think about teachers who step into spaces who are there to instruct on a particular discipline or grade level, but they're also now being asked to be therapists, family counselors, social workers, helping to work with special populations for which they may not have had training. Some of that same applies here when you think about police officers who have been trained to do a certain set of work, and now we've expanded that. And then we're giving them resources perhaps to do that work, but yet we're not thinking about maybe we need to go back and name the folks that we really need to have in the first place: social workers, mental health specialists, addiction specialists, have those folks in place and ask them to do that work versus asking somebody else to do that work that they were not trained and oftentimes may not want to do, because that's the issue.
Pick up on what you said. I had a very interesting conversation with a reverend in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who was talking about teaching religion in schools. And I thought he would be in favor of it, but he wasn't. And I said, well, why? I'm really surprised. And he said, because teachers aren't trained to teach religion. They don't know what they're doing. And so I would rather do that because I have been trained to do this. And it gave me a different perspective on that issue, because I was quite frankly expecting him to say exactly the opposite, but he was tied into what you're saying about who is it that we're asking to do this thing, and is the person or the group that we're asking to do that thing the right group to be involved in that.
Another question that's come in is an interesting one, kind of provocative here. Can affirmative action attenuate racial disparities? Are contractors, employers obligated to incorporate them in their institutions? Interesting question. Certainly, this idea of understanding how affirmative action can be negative or positive is what I think maybe they're trying to get at here. I'd love to give one of you an opportunity to respond to that if you have some ideas.
Well, I've got some ideas about affirmative action, I have to say. And the thing I would say is that I would ask everyone who's listening to redefine affirmative action. Because when you think of affirmative action, you think of programs of uplift or inclusion for Black Americans. America has engaged in affirmative action since the beginning of the country.
Yeah.
Can you think of a more powerful form of affirmative action than giving one race of people the right to own another race? But I'm not done. The Compensated Emancipation Act at the end in 1862, where Abraham Lincoln paid over $1 million to DC slave owners for the enslaved people that were freed. He paid reparations for lost property. The Homestead Act of 1862 gave white Americans 80 to 90 million acres of land for free. Then the government built land grant colleges to teach the people on that land how to farm. Then the government hired county agents to make them better farmers. Then the government gave them low interest rates to mechanize their farms. So the concept of affirmative action has actually been twisted in the American narrative, because the government has always been about doing things for our white population. And so I think we need to move away from even the term of affirmative action and talk about empowering Black and brown communities. And that's one place, quite frankly, where HR 40, the bill for reparations for slavery and its vestiges, once again, people may think, oh my gosh, that is something that will never happen. And that's why I like to engage, because I like to tell people, well, reparations for slavery were already paid. We just paid them to slave owners. HR 40 has over 170 co-sponsors right now. And I wanted to thank Congressman Trone for his leadership, talking about how a privileged white man can show leadership by being in Congress and signing on as a co-sponsor to HR 40. And the debate about that bill is going to make us begin to wrestle and reckon with our history in a way that we have not done before. So this is another reason that I am feeling optimism, because of the action of people. And this issue of affirmative action, which is essentially talking about leveling the economic playing field. That's an issue that America is going to have to grapple with, and I think we're on the verge of doing it.
Congressman Trone, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think Jeff nailed that one pretty good. I was going to loop back a second to the training piece. And we talk about training. I mean, we're trying to train our children to read so they can be at grade level at age 7 or 8. We're trying to train our folks that are incarcerated to come back out and create a new life. But we also have to look at, as you mentioned, our police force. They've not been trained to do those things that you mentioned in addiction and mental health. They should be shifted somewhere else. That money should be repurposed. But we also don't overall train our police force compared to other countries. So average policeman in the US gets 6 months training. The average policeman in Europe and Germany and France gets 24 months training, 4 times as much training. And then we wonder why they don't make good decisions. Why we have, maybe not the best of the best at all times, because we've got to, think about, the education piece of it. And we've ignored the education piece, for our police force. I think it's something we should grapple with.
I really appreciate that, because you're talking about the intersections of education standards. We have one of our local council members who's actually talking with us about this at the college, about how we can be supportive in this idea of, the required professional development that may happen over the course of a year. They may say 16 hours of professional development that may be required of police officers. That may be on ballistics, that may be on, tasers and so forth. But what about these other parts of the work that go far beyond 16 required hours of professional development? And looking at what some other countries might do in the space would be a great opportunity for us to do that. I think I have two more questions for you all. And I think really speaks to this issue of disparity oftentimes. And Francine Wyman, she asked this question here, that legal representation in civil court cases like child custody, domestic violence protection, housing related cases can be costly and are frequently devastating and or out of reach for people of low or moderate means, and disproportionately affecting people of color. What reforms can be made to provide universal access to legal aid in civil cases to provide equality?
That's a question for the lawyer.
Well, and I would just say what we're talking about is a reallocation of resources. And what I'd like people to remember is that earlier this year, Congress came up with $3 trillion in about 3 weeks. So I really don't want to hear that we can't fund something that needs to be funded. It is really the will to fund that we're talking about. And I think what that has to do is, as Kendi talks about, where your activism is, talking to elected officials, and not just electing them, but then holding them accountable once they get there. And so I think when we are talking about resources, when we are talking about money, if it's important, America comes up with it every single time. So we need to ask ourselves what is really important to us. And if we start answering those questions in local governments and state governments across America, I think we will be coming up with some different answers. Congress can do a lot, but Congress is limited to the federal government, and Congress can set examples and give incentives. But I think leadership at the state and local level is really, really important.
So interesting. Earlier, I had a conversation with one of our state elected officials, and we were talking about transportation. And he talked about this idea that at some point we have to really start to expand or add depth to the list of things that we describe as a public good. We certainly recognize and value education and compulsory K-12 education. We know that that's a public good, and therefore we make investments in that as a country. We talked about infrastructure and so forth. I started to venture to this question of healthcare, obviously, as being something that at some point we should say there is a responsibility and a right that you should have as a member of this society to have access to that. And maybe the next iteration of that is this question that Francine asked about also legal representation in courts of law, or ways to make your life better, to access the rights and privileges that we say that we're about. And I think that's such a provocative thing to me about how we decide what our values are, who has access to certain things, and most importantly, who doesn't have access to them.
Do you think that large law firms in America have any problem making money, making huge amounts of money? And do you think corporations in America have any problem accessing lawyers when they need them? We could have a legal system that required lawyers, not lawyers who are public defenders or who are doing this, to work all the time, but we could have a system that required us to provide the kind of representation that the woman was talking about in her question. People will say, it's not capitalist, it's making people work and do things that maybe they don't or shouldn't have to do. And once again, it comes back to what is it that we truly value?
Exactly. And who do we really and truly value, right? I'm going to end on the voice of one of our students. And I love this because our students are more and more watching these dialogues and engaging. And I can almost hear the student's voice. Fazli Hameen ask a very simple question that I think is an important one to end on. We think about this whole dialogue series that we've been engaged in, and think about the issues of criminal justice reform and the law that we've explored over the last hour and a half. I'd love to ask you, in her words, What steps can I take as a student to promote racial justice? I'll ask you, Congressman Trone, if you'd like to respond to that, and then certainly you, Mr. Robinson.
I think one of the most important things you can do is get involved politically. You know, be sure you vote, be sure all your friends vote, be sure you're informed about the issues, understand where the candidates stand, and then work in a campaign and work in the political process. Because, you know, if you want to help get us to where we need to be, you know, we need you inside the tent to help drive it. And the second point would be is, you know, volunteer for groups that you think really make a difference. Go help out the ACLU. You know, this is a phenomenal organization that we're really proud to support. It does such great work, you know, in so many different areas. But step up as a volunteer, be an intern. You know, that's just really, really important to take action. Again, to Jeff's point, don't just rest on, I hope things will be different. Well, that's not going to make them different. Focus on your action concretely, what you can do, and you absolutely can make a difference and improve the lives and get us the equity and the justice that our country deserves, finally.
Thank you so much, Congressman Trone. Mr. Robinson.
I think I would just add one thing to what the congressman said. This is a battle for the soul of America. And in any battle, you have to be armed. I'm not talking about weapons. I'm talking about knowledge and knowledge of our history. I am armed because of the research and the studying that I have done. The history, the true history of America's relationship to racism and white supremacy is out there. It may be hiding, but it's hiding in plain sight, in original source documents. And so educate yourself. When I say be armed, I mean educate yourself about the truth about our history. When someone says, well, the Constitution was a document that was all about freedom, say, what about the 3/5 clause? What about the clause that said that they could keep bringing enslaved people until 1820 or 1808? And what about the clause that then says you can't amend that clause until 1808? They doubled down on white supremacy. And so that doesn't mean America isn't a great country, but when you start saying that there are root causes to these problems, and when you can talk in factual terms, that sends people to maybe go read something or do research and go, oh my God, she was right about that. Oh my God, she was right about that. That is the moment of cognitive dissonance.
Yes.
The moment when a person's beliefs are challenged by new information, and that person at that moment is capable of doing things that they have never done before, of voting for something they've never done before, of supporting a cause they've never supported before. So by arming yourself with knowledge and then using that knowledge in your conversations with your family, with your friends, in your community, you can actually make a difference. So I'd encourage you, arm yourself and don't be shy about talking about what's going on in our country.
Thank you so much. I have to tell you, this was a little bit of soul food for me today, being able to engage into this dialogue with the both of you. It's been wonderfully informative, and I certainly hope that our viewers will continue to work through and engage around these issues in their homes, in their workplaces, and other civic areas. Mr. Robinson, thank you so much for the time that you've taken to share your experience. I'm so grateful for your leadership in this space around racial justice and legal spaces, and for your dedication to examining history and how history, the unvarnished truth of history, I think has the potential to liberate us if we're willing to stand it and look it in the face and understand what the implications are. And I tell you, I'm looking forward to your documentary, Who We Are, A Chronicle of Racism in America. Again, you cannot understand America unless you're willing to understand its history with race as well. And I believe that you spent some 9 years researching it. And I know that you have a strong team working behind you on that. So I'm certain it's going to be a rich production. conversation. And Congressman Trone, my congressman, so delighted to have had you here today. I have to tell you a funny thing. I was talking with my son about what I was going to be doing today. And he says, "Oh, I know Congressman Trone." He said, "He's on my YouTube channel all the time." And I thought, elections, I thought that was so funny. So I just want to let you know that that's working, because he understood, he knew exactly who you were. I want to thank you for your generous time and energy, your personal commitment to these issues, because the fact, and I loved how Mr. Robinson said earlier, you use your privilege in this space in a way to disrupt a narrative that could be easily ignored, even one that you could choose to ignore, and you don't choose to ignore that. So I'm so profoundly grateful to you and for the representation that you do of our students in our community and of Montgomery College. We've had multiple conversations over the course of this pandemic, and I am always amazed that you call and say, "Let me sit down and talk with you about some issues," and I'm really appreciative of that. I'm grateful to both of you for being tremendous allies in building racial justice. It's discussions like this that we have to do in the public spaces that empower people, that they have to bear witness to it, have to grapple with it, have to really understand that you can hold multiple ideas in your brain at the same time and try to reconcile what that means for us every day. That's what the purpose of this dialogue series is for. And I'm just so grateful to each of you for being here today. I also want to acknowledge MCTV and their wonderful, marvelous production skills. Some of my favorite folks at the college, because they are professional, they're kind, caring, and they're about the work. So thank you, MCTV, for what you do. I also want to thank the Meyer Foundation, one of our sponsors, who have really created the space for us to take these public conversations into the public spaces. And then a big shout out to Bethesda Magazine, our media sponsor, an important community connector. More and more, we're looking to Bethesda Magazine and Bethesda Beat as this real central place of information sharing. So I'm so grateful to them. And of course, from my own office, Dr. Megan Gibbons, who does such a wonderful job of preparing me and preparing for this production. Tremendously grateful to all of you. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. I look forward to receiving your feedback and look forward to seeing you for our year-long conversation about building racial justice. Thank you all for joining in, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day. And more importantly, wash your hands, practice social distancing, and be careful of each other. Thank you.